started like any other adventure for thrill seekers like me, Adam, and Max. We'd run out of places to explore in our small town. We'd already explored every abandoned house, closed down mall, and crumbling factory we could find. You know, the kind of places where the ceilings are falling in and the smell of rot and decay lingers in the air. But it was getting old. We wanted something bigger, something more terrifying. When Max brought up Red Creek Asylum, it felt like the obvious next step, or at least that's what we told ourselves. They say it's haunted, Max said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I remember the way he said it, like he was daring us to back out. Naturally, we didn't. We laughed it off, pretending the idea didn't freak us out. Red Creek was infamous. Everyone knew about it. It was way out in the forest, and the rumors about the place were enough to give anyone chills. There were stories of unethical experiments done there, of restless spirits haunting the place, and yeah, even a few people who had supposedly disappeared. But that's all they were, just stories, right? At least, that's what we kept telling ourselves over and over as we packed our flashlights and hopped into Adam's rusty old car. The rain started as we drove. A light drizzle at first, but by the time we were deep in the forest, it was pouring. The road was barely visible, just a narrow dirt path winding between trees. Max sat in the back seat, rattling off the asylum's dark history. How it was shut down in the 1950s, how people claimed you could still hear screams if you listened closely. "You're not helping," I said, trying to sound casual. But the truth was, the wind howling through the trees and the rain beating down on the car made it feel like the forest itself didn't want us there. Adam just smirked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You scared, man?" he asked. I laughed even though, yeah, I was. When we finally reached the asylum, it was worse than I'd imagined. The building was enormous, much larger than it had looked in the pictures. The windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in creeping vines. The rain made everything glisten, like the whole place was sweating. I shivered, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. We parked a short distance away, just in case someone drove by, though out here in the middle of nowhere, that was unlikely. We grabbed our flashlights, and I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. I wanted to suggest we turn around and go home, but then I saw the look on Max's face. Giddy and excited, and I couldn't bring myself to say it. I didn't want to be the one to back out. As we made our way toward the asylum, we heard it. A voice, faint but clear enough to make us all freeze. "Come join us," it said, just like that. I looked around, my heart racing, but there was no one, just trees and shadows. "Probably just someone messing with us," Adam said, but his voice was tense, like he was trying to convince himself. Max just grinned. "Or maybe the ghosts are looking for some company," he joked, raising his eyebrows. I tried to laugh, but it came out sounding more like a cough. We found a broken window around the side of the building and climbed in one by one. As soon as I dropped into the basement, the smell hit me, like something had died down there and never been found. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. "Gross," I muttered, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Welcome to Red Creek," Max said, imitating a tour guide. Adam snickered, but there was a nervous edge to it, like we were all trying too hard to act normal. The basement was pitch black, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in graffiti, names, dates, but also strange symbols that seemed to move if you stared too long. I shook my head, trying to focus. We started walking, our footsteps echoing. Everything was damp, the floor slick beneath our shoes, and the deeper we went, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on us. I kept telling myself it was just the stories getting to me, but then we heard it again, a laugh, soft and playful, but somehow wrong. Max turned, his grin a little shaky now. "Guess we're not alone after all," he said. I forced a smile, but deep down, I knew this was a bad idea. A really bad idea. We'd only been in the asylum for a few minutes, but already I could feel something was off. The air felt heavier, and that awful smell was getting worse. The building was supposed to be creepy. It was an abandoned asylum after all. But there was something more, something I couldn't quite explain. "Do you guys hear that?" Adam asked, stopping in his tracks, his flashlight pointing ahead. I strained to listen, and yeah, there was something, a soft whispering, coming from further inside the building. My heart pounded and I glanced at Max. He shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's probably just the wind," he said, but I could tell he was just as nervous as I was. Then Max, always the risk taker, suggested we split up. "Cover more ground that way," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I froze. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that splitting up was never a good idea. But Max was already planning different routes, and Adam was nodding along. "I don't know, guys," I started, but Max gave me a look, daring me to be the coward. "Fine, but we meet back here in 10 minutes, I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Max grinned. "Deal." He clapped me on the shoulder before walking off into the dark, his flashlight bobbing. Adam gave me a small, uncertain smile and headed in the opposite direction. Suddenly, I was alone. For a long time, whenever I had the chance, I'd go hiking. It started out as a way to relieve stress. I'd head out alone for walks in the nearby park to clear my mind or work through some personal issues. As my job and relationships grew more demanding, I found myself needing to cover longer distances for extended periods, much like how an addict needs more of their fix to feel satisfied. Over time, things got easier, and I went from being a stressed-out couch potato to becoming a somewhat active outdoors person. But one thing that never got easier was hiking in the woods after dark or before dawn, especially in more isolated areas. Sometimes, especially in summer, I'd purposely set off in the late afternoon so I could experience the woods at night. Though I said it never got easier, it also never got dull. There's something both thrilling and primal about being out there in the dark, like you're tapping into some of humanity's oldest fears, being afraid of the deep, dark forest. It feels almost like you're somewhere forbidden, like you're crossing a line into a place you shouldn't be. What I usually did was start my hike in the late afternoon, explore a few trails with my flashlight, then take a short nap in my hammock before waking up just before dawn to catch the sunrise. These night hikes usually went smoothly, and I never felt the need to reach for my bear spray, except for this one time that scared me to my core. It was late spring, around 4:30 in the morning, and I'd just woken up, a little less than an hour before sunrise. I had about 5 miles left to cover before reaching my car, and I was in a small valley wedged between two steep ridges. The path was narrow, muddy, and bordered by thick brush, with young maple trees and older oak trees surrounding me. I focused on the small light from my headlamp, taking one step at a time, lost in thought. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud crack, and I froze in place. My first instinct was either to run or defend myself, but I'm not someone who runs away easily. As much as I wanted to take off, my logical side convinced me it was nothing dangerous. But then, just as I was calming down, I heard the same sound again. This time, it was harder to explain away, and real fear set in. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking or something natural. It sounded like a sturdy stick being slammed against a tree with force. And what made it worse was how unnatural it sounded. It wasn't a dull thud, but more of an explosive crack, as if someone was hitting a tree with all their might. The sound came from about 50 yards ahead of me. I realized I'd have to pass by whatever was making that noise, and soon, the trail would turn sharply, forcing me to walk with my back to it. That thought terrified me. I really didn't want to turn my back on whatever was out there, but if I wanted to get back to my car, I had no other option. So I stayed still for a while, listening. After a minute or two, there was total silence. I only had about 30 minutes before sunrise, but I didn't want to wait. I debated whether to keep my headlamp off to avoid drawing attention to myself or turn it on to get a better view of what might be lurking. In the end, I decided it was better to see what I was dealing with, even if it was something or someone dangerous. So, I was just about to turn my headlamp on when I smelled it. I've smelled enough dead animals in my life to recognize the stench of death. When I was 9, my outdoor cat Oscar went missing for a week. My parents and I made posters and searched the neighborhood. Eventually, my mom took me to the woods behind our house, hoping to find Oscar. I'll never forget the smell of finding him there. That was my first encounter with the scent of death. The second time was when I accidentally hit a possum with my truck and drove for miles with it stuck under the vehicle. But this smell in the woods wasn't quite the same as death, though it was close. It had the same overpowering stench as rotten meat, but it wasn't old. It was fresh, like wet fur mixed with something foul. It was beyond disgusting, but it didn't seem like the smell of decay. It was something alive. Just as I was trying to make sense of it, I heard another crack, and that was enough to make me bolt in the opposite direction. I ended up doubling or tripling my journey back to the car, but there was no way I was going to keep moving toward that sound. I didn't even dare turn my headlamp on. I didn't want to light myself up like a beacon. I ran as fast as I could until I ran out of energy, then continued in short bursts, pushing myself harder than ever before. The fear I felt was primal, like something ancient was chasing me. I'm not a runner, but that morning, I ran harder and longer than I ever thought possible. Now, whenever I tell this story, people often mention that the wood clacking noise is a common sign of Bigfoot. I didn't know that when I first shared a shorter version of this, but let me be clear. I don't believe in Bigfoot, and I don't think I encountered anything supernatural. I have no idea what was out there that morning, but whatever it was terrifying. I grew up in the 70s in a small town called Fairview up in Alberta. It was a nice enough place, a good spot to raise a family. But after I scraped my way through high school, I faced a somewhat bleak future. I didn't much like the idea of working low-end jobs around Fairview for the rest of my life, but I also didn't want to just up and leave. I liked the town. My friends and family were all there. But most of the jobs available meant punching a time clock for someone else. I couldn't stand the thought of taking orders from someone all day, and I didn't want to be a cop, fireman, or anything else that paid well without a degree. The only thing I really wanted to do was work on motorcycles. The problem was, I didn't own a bike, nor did I have the money to buy one. Even if I worked a minimum wage job, I'd be stuck flipping burgers for a year and a half just to afford the cheapest model I had my eye on. Then my uncle told me about a logging company up near Clearwater that was hiring. Back then, it wasn't hard to get into logging, mainly because you had to be a bit crazy to want to do something that dangerous. But the pay was great, and since you didn't need a diploma, it was a popular choice for guys who had the guts to do such a risky job. Remember, this was the late 70s. Safety regulations weren't what they are now. There weren't reflective safety strips on every piece of gear. Injuries happened regularly, and when I first started, some of the guys said I wouldn't last a month without getting my first scar. I figured if I was careful, I could last the 7 months I needed to afford a bike without getting hurt. And I was right. Most of that talk was just to mess with the new guy. But there was another guy who signed on around the same time as me. Same age, same background, and he didn't make it. To this day, nobody really knows what happened to him. His name was Adam, but everyone called him McNally. We didn't work together much, so I didn't know him well, but I'd heard stories. He was quiet, kind of lazy, and didn't seem to fit in. He caused issues for the crews he worked with, was often late, even at the logging camps where there was nowhere else to go, and sometimes disappeared for an hour or more. The guys thought he was sneaking off to get high, but the crew chief never found anything on him, so they just gave him warnings. One day, McNally just vanished. His crew said he walked into the woods, saying he needed to relieve himself, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Since we weren't at a logging camp, the crew figured he'd just quit and walked back to Clearwater without telling anyone. They didn't even notice he was gone for a few hours. The next day, when he didn't show up for work, we assumed he was gone for good. A week later, his mom showed up at the foreman's office, worried because she hadn't heard from him. She hadn't called the cops right away and had been driving around looking for him herself. That made us suspect McNally might have been involved in something illegal. Why else wouldn't she call the police? But that's just a theory. Maybe she didn't want the cops finding him before she did. A couple of days later, the police came around and asked us to help search the woods where McNally went missing. The foreman wasn't thrilled. Maybe the cops thought one of us had something to do with his disappearance. Still, nobody objected to helping, especially since it was one of our own who could be in trouble. McNally wasn't a bad guy, just a bit off, and seeing his mom so shaken up made us all want to pitch in. We lined up and walked through the woods, scanning the ground. Just when we were about to turn back, one of the guys on the edge of the search line called out that he'd found something, a boot lying in the dirt. We didn't know exactly what boots McNally had been wearing, but we all knew, somehow, that it was his. The police called off the search after that and brought in more people to continue. Some of the crew thought we were overreacting. After all, it was just a boot. Maybe McNally had wandered off to get high and lost it. Others were convinced it was something more serious, maybe even a murder. Not long after, McNally's body was found in the woods. The cops didn't tell us much, but rumors started flying. Word was that they hadn't found a whole body, just pieces. People assumed an animal had gotten to him, but then things took a darker turn. The cops came back with a search warrant and took 3 guys from McNally's crew in for questioning. For a while, people thought maybe his crew had gotten sick of him and decided to take him out. But that didn't make much sense. He was about to get fired anyway. The guys were released without charges, and the cops never bothered us again. Later, we found out why. McNally's body hadn't been cut up with a saw or anything like that. His arms, legs, and head had been torn off and stacked neatly inside a hollow tree. The police wouldn't confirm or deny this, but we all knew it was true. After that, I finished out my time in the logging industry and bought my motorcycle. I heard a lot of stories about what happened to McNally, but I try not to speculate. Whether it was something criminal or something we can't explain, it could have just as easily been me out there, torn apart and stacked in that tree. In the winter of 2008, my friends and I, all in our late 20s, were doing odd jobs to make ends meet. We mostly hung out at a buddy's apartment, drinking cheap beer, smoking cannabis resin, and flipping through TV channels. One night, we stumbled upon a survival show featuring Ray Mears, who was a bit like a 90s version of Bear Grylls. Watching him eat raw fish and forage for food, we started debating which of us would last longest on a survival trip. What started as a playful argument turned into a serious bet between Luke and Ben, 2 of the guys. They bet 100 pounds on who could survive longer in the wilderness. At first, it seemed like just talk, but before I knew it, we were planning a trip. They initially wanted to go to Dartmoor, where the Royal Marines train, but Ben's brother, who was in the army, said it would be too dangerous in the colder months. Instead, he suggested we head to Kielder Forest in Northumberland, a place he described as the closest thing to real wilderness in the UK. With the location set, Luke and Ben were determined. But there was one problem. They needed someone to make sure they didn't cheat by sneaking off to a hotel. That's where I came in as the designated referee. I didn't need much convincing. I was already half interested in the idea. However, I didn't think starving ourselves in the woods was a smart plan, so I came up with a structured challenge. We would walk about 21 miles over 3 days, sleep 2 nights in the forest, and end the trip with a night in a comfortable bed and breakfast. By early March, we had gathered all the gear we needed: ponchos, boil-in-the-bag meals, proper sleeping bags, and took an early morning train to Carlisle. After a bus ride to Brampton, we set off into the wilderness. The first day wasn't too bad, mostly walking through farmland with Kielder Forest looming in the distance. But by the time we reached the edge of the forest to set up camp, the cold wind had picked up and sleeping outside was rough. We barely slept, shivering in our bags, and by morning, we were already feeling the toll. The next day, the real challenge began as we trekked deeper into the forest. The trails disappeared, and the terrain became rougher, making it hard to navigate. Luke and Ben, who had no experience with wilderness hiking, were struggling, and by the afternoon, the mood was pretty low. We were tired, and it was clear we weren't covering as much ground as we had planned. To make things worse, we only had limited food and clean clothes. That's when we stumbled upon Burnside Lodge, a small clearing with 2 buildings, an old cottage and a smaller stone structure known as a bothy, a basic shelter left open for travelers. Exhausted, we decided to rest in the bothy. Ben, curious about the cottage, wandered over to check it out. Moments later, a dog started barking, and a man appeared from the woods, shouting at us. We assumed he was the owner of the cottage, so I hurried to get Ben out of there. The man, with his dog on a leash, approached us, clearly upset. But after some tense moments, he suddenly broke into laughter, saying he was just joking. He wasn't the owner but knew the guy who owned the place, and he assured us that both the bothy and the cottage were open to travelers. Despite his humor, the man, who claimed his name was Gary, though it was obviously a lie, gave us all an uneasy feeling. His dog, a large and aggressive-looking animal, wouldn't stop growling at us. Then, out of nowhere, Gary asked if any of us had ever been, and I'll spell it out, RAPD. The question was so bizarre and disturbing that we didn't know how to react at first. Ben, being the tough guy he was, stepped forward, clearly ready to fight, but the dog went wild, barking and straining at its leash. We quickly decided we weren't going to stick around. As soon as Gary went back into the cottage, we packed up and left, heading back into the woods. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, we heard the sound of the dog barking again, this time getting closer. Realizing that Gary might be following us, we picked up our pace, the fear kicking in. After some time, the barking got louder, and we saw the dog coming through the trees. We reached a stream and had no choice but to cross it, even though the water was freezing and deep. Luckily, the dog didn't follow us into the water. It just barked at us from the other side before running back towards its owner. We didn't stop to question why, we just kept moving. Eventually, we made it to the edge of the forest, exhausted and soaked, but grateful to be out of danger. We tried calling the police, but with limited reception and no real crime committed, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd have someone check out the bothy, but we knew it was best to just keep moving. After that terrifying experience, our survival trip quickly lost its appeal, and we decided to cut it short. We didn't need another run-in with Gary or his dog to know we were done with the wilderness. It all seemed like a great idea at first, getting away from the chaos of city life, the crowds, the noise, the constant responsibilities. Just us, the forest, and the comforting crackle of a campfire. It was Jake who suggested the Wyoming wilderness. He said he knew a secluded spot, way off any well-trodden path, a place where no one else would think to go. Honestly, it sounded ideal, almost too ideal, but at the time, I wasn't thinking about much beyond escaping. The dirt road stretched on for miles, a narrow track cutting through thick woods. The towering pine trees blocked most of the sunlight, their branches arching overhead like a canopy. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. No birds, no breeze, just the low hum of the truck's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. It wasn't exactly the postcard-perfect piece I had imagined, but there was something about it that drew me in, like we were entering another world. Ben leaned forward from the back seat, staring out the window. "Think we're gonna find Bigfoot out here?" he asked with a smirk. Jake chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. "More like we'll find out how fast we can run if we do." I tried to laugh, but it came out more like a nervous cough. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in. Maybe it was because my phone had lost signal about an hour ago, or maybe it was how the trees seemed to press in around us like they were cutting off any chance of escape. Whatever it was, I kept it to myself. By late afternoon, we finally reached the clearing, a small patch of open ground next to a still lake. The water was so calm it reflected the treetops perfectly, like a mirror into another world. We climbed out, stretched our legs, and began unpacking. Jake and Ben got to work setting up the tents, while Lily and Megan gathered firewood. I wandered around the edge of the clearing, trying to shake the unease that had taken hold of me. There wasn't much to see, just more trees and a few deer tracks leading down to the water. I stood by the lake for a while, letting the quiet settle over me. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, though. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl like you're being watched but can't figure out from where. "You all right, Matt?" Megan called from behind me, arms full of branches. I turned and forced a smile. "Yeah, just soaking it all in." She nodded but lingered a bit longer than I was comfortable with before heading back to camp. That evening, we gathered around the campfire. Jake told a few stories, mostly funny ones to keep the mood light, but then he brought up something Lily had mentioned earlier. It was an old story her grandmother had told her, about a creature that could change its shape. A skinwalker, Jake called it. He made it sound like a joke, but his eyes kept flicking toward the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "Come on, Jake. Quit trying to freak us out," Lily said, tossing a pine cone into the fire. But her voice had a nervous edge, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. "Hey, if you see me wandering around out there tonight, don't follow," Jake said with a grin. We all laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that's too quick, too loud, meant to drown out the silence. That night, I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees creak. But there was something else too. A slow, deliberate rustling, coming closer. My heart pounded as I unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peek out. There was nothing there, just the dying campfire's faint glow. I zipped the tent back up, feeling foolish, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I closed my eyes. The next morning, the light was pale and cold as it filtered through the trees. Jake was already up, poking at the fire. "Sleep all right?" he asked. The unease in his eyes matched what I felt in my chest. "Like a baby," I lied. We both knew it wasn't true. As we packed up to go for a hike, there was a weird tension in the air, like the world had shifted just a little overnight. Even though we tried to ignore it, it was clear that we were all on edge. At one point during the hike, Ben stopped suddenly, staring ahead. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We all gathered around, and there, half hidden in the underbrush, was the torn-apart carcass of a deer. Its ribs were exposed, the flesh torn away like something had attacked it viciously. "Cougar, maybe," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. The body wasn't just torn apart. It was arranged, almost like it had been placed there for us to find. That night, the air around the campfire felt heavy. The silence was broken only by the crackling flames, and no one was in the mood for more stories. Just after midnight, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a rhythm, words almost. My name, whispered from somewhere beyond the fire's light. "Did you hear that?" Megan whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, I heard it." Jake stood up, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the trees. It flickered, and for just a moment, I saw something. A tall, thin figure standing just beyond the firelight. Then the beam steadied, and it was gone. "Who's out there?" Jake shouted. No answer, just the whispers growing louder, circling us. We didn't sleep that night. The sense that something was out there, watching, waiting, was undeniable. By morning, we all agreed to leave. As we packed up, every sound felt like a warning. When we finally reached the trucks, the whispers followed us, mocking, calling out our names. As we sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. And when I glanced in the side mirror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. It looked like me. Even after we left the forest far behind, the dread lingered. We reached a small town and stopped at a gas station. When I stepped out of the truck, there was a note pinned under the windshield wiper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed, and the message was simple, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Don't come back." On a winter evening in 1978, 25-year-old Gary Dale Mathias drove 4 of his friends to a basketball game at Chico University in California. They were all part of a team called the Gateway Gators from Yuba City, which was made up of individuals with mental challenges. The team was set to compete in a week-long tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics, where the winners would be awarded an all-expense-paid trip to Hollywood. Alongside Mathias, the team included 29-year-old Bill Sterling, 24-year-old Jack Hewitt, 32-year-old Ted Weir, and 30-year-old Jack Madruga. Sterling and Hewitt had been diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities, while Weir and Madruga, though not officially diagnosed, also had learning difficulties. Both Mathias and Madruga were veterans, but while Madruga's military service was relatively quiet, Mathias's time in West Germany left a more troubling mark. During his service, Mathias developed a severe addiction to drugs, which led to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was medically discharged and returned home for treatment at the VA hospital in Yuba City. Mathias had a history of violent outbursts, often bringing him into contact with the police, but by 1978, his behavior had calmed down significantly due to a strict regimen of psychiatric medication. His doctors considered him one of their success stories, thanks to medications like Stelazine and Cogentin, and said he was capable of living a fairly normal life. Mathias earned some money by working in his stepfather's gardening business and was a vital member of the Gateway Gators, often driving the team to their games. Although their tournament game wasn't scheduled until the next afternoon, Mathias and the others headed to Chico a day early to support the UC Davis basketball team. After watching the game, the group stopped by a market to pick up snacks before leaving at around 10 p.m. According to the store clerks, the group seemed to be in good spirits. However, they were never seen alive again. When the men didn't return home, their worried families contacted the police. Search efforts began immediately, covering the route from Chico to Yuba City. Days later, on February 28th, a ranger discovered their car, a 1969 Mercury Montego, abandoned on a remote dirt road about 70 miles away from Chico. The car was undamaged with a quarter tank of gas, and the inside was tidy, aside from a few candy wrappers. This raised questions. Why had they driven so far off course into the mountains and abandoned the car, especially in the cold without proper clothing? Police noted that the snow wasn't deep enough to trap the car, and the 5 men could have easily pushed it free. Mechanical issues were ruled out when the car was hot-wired and found to be working fine. The keys were missing, but it seemed the men had left the car intentionally. The car's undercarriage was also in pristine condition, which was surprising given the rough mountain terrain, leading authorities to wonder whether the driver had extensive knowledge of the road. Heavy snowstorms hampered search efforts, and weeks passed without any new leads. Then, a man named Joseph Shans came forward with a chilling account. On the night the men disappeared, Shans had driven up to his cabin in the same area. His car got stuck in the snow, and while trying to free it, he began experiencing symptoms of a heart attack. He returned to his car, trying to stay warm, and around midnight, saw a car's headlights approaching. Shans recalled seeing a group of people, possibly including a woman with a baby, near the vehicle. He called out for help, but the group turned off their lights and walked away. Shans later passed the abandoned Mercury Montego on his way to a hospital and believed it was the same car. A second report came from a woman working at a grocery store in a nearby town. She claimed that 2 days after the men vanished, they visited her store in a red pickup truck, bought food, and left quickly. One of the men's family members confirmed that one of the purchases, a large amount of chocolate milk, was something their relative often drank. Months later, in June, as the snow melted, a group of motorcyclists discovered a trailer maintained by the U.S. Forest Service, about 20 miles from where the car was found. Inside, they made a horrifying discovery: the body of Ted Weir. He had lost more than half his body weight and had severe frostbite. His beard indicated he had survived for around 13 weeks. Weir's body was covered with a sheet, suggesting someone else had been with him, but strangely, he had not attempted to light a fire, despite the available materials. Searchers later found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, who appeared to have succumbed to the cold and were partially eaten by animals. Jack Hewitt's remains were found by his father 2 days later, about 2 miles from the trailer. However, Gary Mathias was never found. Near Weir's body, investigators found Mathias's shoes and some supplies, but no other trace of him. While it's believed the men died of hypothermia, many aspects of the case remain baffling. Why didn't they use the supplies in the trailer to survive? Why did they leave the warmth of their car? And what happened to Gary Mathias? Some suggest their disabilities contributed to poor decision-making, while others believe something far more sinister forced them to flee into the freezing wilderness.